Hello everyone, this is Professor Reimer. This video is for my world history class for Thursday, May 20th and Friday, May 21st. It's entitled Unit 10, DOL 1, The Early Cold War. In this lesson, we will explain how the outcome of World War II contributed to the development of the Cold War by responding to a prompt. As a heads up, this is the last unit, and we will focus on two primary topics, the Cold War and decolonization, essentially the history of the world from the end of World War II until the present day. Now, as always, let's begin with a preview. Do you know what is this organization? You see its symbol here, its headquarters here, and the inside of the building. Pause the video, come back, see if you're right. All right, this is the United Nations. We'll get to it in just a minute. Now, there is a viewing guide, a note-taking guide to go along with this presentation. So have that printed and in front of you so that you can follow along. If you can't print it, I would suggest using paper or maybe a different screen if you want to do it, all digitally. But highly, highly encourage you to be writing your notes on the note-taking guide or on paper as we go through this lesson. So here we go. The end of World War II, it led to important changes in the world. As a review, World War II was a struggle between the Axis powers, you see there in yellow, primarily the Japanese Empire and the German Empire and its ally Italy, against the Allied powers, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and its colonies, and the United States. As a result of the war, the Allies won. The Soviet Union and the United States and the United Kingdom won. Now, what are some of those changes? As I just mentioned, the United Nations was created. It replaced the League of Nations, that original international organization that was supposed to promote peace and cooperation after World War I. That didn't work in stopping World War II. So the world nations created a new international organization to replace it. By now, almost all countries in the world are members. I think this is Western Mauritania. It's a disputed territory, and there are a few other small disputed territories that are not members of the United Nations, but pretty much all the world countries are now. And it meets, the UN meets in New York City. I've been to this building. It's quite interesting to imagine all the countries of the world. They all get together. They all can understand each other. They have lots of interpreters. And the decisions are made primarily by the Executive Council. It has 5 permanent members and rotating members. And they do a variety of functions, from peacekeeping operations to funding initiatives to help feed children, and what are some of the other major ones? UNESCO is like the big one. Oh yeah, so they help preserve historic world sites and many other things. Now, one of its first actions was to create a Jewish nation known as Israel, which set up a series of wars with Arabs in the Middle East. Now, we're going to come back to this topic, but just as a preview, Palestine was given to the British as a mandate after World War I, essentially a colony. And the British promised the Arabs, for fighting with them against the Germans in World War I, an Arab state. I'm sorry, they promised the Jews. They promised the Jews an Arab state. They also made promises to the Arabs. And so essentially, the British reneged on their promises to the Arabs and essentially left. And there was this, battle between the Arabs living, what we now call Palestinians, in these territories, and the new Jewish settlers. And to sort of mediate this crisis, the UN carved out a part of Palestine for the Jewish state. The Palestinians living there were not in favor of such a situation, and they began a war which the new state of Israel won. And as this map will show, it was not the first war. There was a series of wars, most notably in 1967, when Israel expanded its territory, most notably in this area called Golan Heights, and the West Bank and the Sinai Peninsula. That they have since returned some of that territory, but not all. And beginning in the 1980s, the Palestinians, frustrated with the situation in Israel, their lack of rights, their lack of economic opportunities, began to fight back using guerrilla tactics, resistance tactics, terrorism, but also others. We're going to get more into this Arab-Israeli conflict and the efforts to bring peace. But that's not our main focus today. Our main focus today is the Cold War. But we're a little bit of a preview. Changes coming after World War II. The United States and Japan occupied it, helped rebuild it, helped write its constitution, provided defense, provided investments, and Japan recovered quite quickly thanks to the U.S. Occupation. Also, the end of the war helps bring those independence movements that had been germinating in Africa and in South Asia for many decades to fruition. It's what we call decolonization, right? The ending of European colonies and the establishment of independent states. We'll talk more about what brought these about and the effects later on in this union. But as I said today, our main topic for today is the beginning of the Cold War, one of the most important changes after World War II. It's a realignment of global powers after the war, because essentially the war left the United States and the Soviet Union as the two sole superpowers. Yes, the United Kingdom was an ally, but they were severely weakened and tired from both world wars, and they began to pull back from empire, leaving the United States and the Soviet Union. And as we'll discuss, they enter very soon into this distrust and ultimately hostility that we call the Cold War. All right, as I said, superpowers, and eventually they become rivals. They dominate world politics. So let's review sort of what their major ideologies were, and so we can understand better how they came to be became rivals. Because remember, they were allies during World War II. So on the left, these are values of the United States, and on the right, characteristics of the Soviet Union. So in the United States, right, their economic system is based on capitalism or private ownership of industry. Government plays a smaller role, but not a large role. And their government is democratic. The people participate in the government and elect their own leaders. The Soviet Union adopted a socialist economy in which the government owns the industries and the farms. And unfortunately, their government eventually came to be led by a dictator, Joseph Stalin, and then others. Right? It's important to point out that these two systems sort of stem from different values of the two countries. Right? The United States values independence and values freedoms, but that leads to both pros and cons. Right? It leads to great standards of living, but also this wide divide between rich and poor. In the Soviet Union, they valued more equality. Right? The goal is to have a classless society, and as a result, they adopted this socialist model. All right, yeah, as I said, right, two different kinds of values. Right? The United States on the left, freedom and individualism, and on the right, the Soviet Union's values of equality and collectivism. So I point that out, that neither one is quote unquote correct. Neither one is quote unquote perfect. They are different, and they're different because they're based on different values. But at the time, that was not very clearly understood. They very soon saw each other as the enemy for reasons we're going to to discuss. All right, to review the two sides, right? We have the capitalist world and the communist world. I'm just going to read you these two quotes. For capitalism, all industry, business and agriculture should be owned by private people or firms. Competition between rival factories or shops or farms will cause prices to fall and make firms more efficient. For communism, everything belongs to the state and should be run by the government on behalf of the people. A classless society achieved by overthrowing capitalism by revolution, which is how the Communist Party came to power in the Soviet Union. All right, so it's an era of competing ideologies. The United States wants to promote its values of democracy and capitalism, while the USSR tries to spread its system of communism. This difference, right, very soon leads to distrust, hostility, and eventually battles between their proxies or their friends, and unfortunately near nuclear war. So let's get into some of those events that bring about this mistrust. It begins really during World War II. There were tensions already between the USA, represented by the president Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Stalin, who was the leader of the USSR. He never trusted the British or the USA during World War II. For one, they had a project called the Manhattan Project, working to develop nuclear weapons, and they did not share it with Stalin. They also delayed providing a second front, opening a second front, while the Soviets were bearing the brunt of the German attacks, especially at Stalingrad. So towards the end of the war, 1945, that's what's known as the Yalta Conference, right? They have to decide what's going to become of Eastern Europe, right? The Soviet Union had pushed from its territories and fighting the Germans back across Eastern Europe to Germany. So in 1945, right, the area in purple, that's controlled by the Red Army, and the area in green is controlled by the armies of France, USA, and Great Britain. So what's going to become of Eastern Europe? Stalin promised to allow self-determination, in other words, to let the people decide what kind of governments they want. But he also wanted what he called a buffer zone, an area to provide a cushion, right, in case another attack from the West came, like in World War I, like in World War II. He wanted a series of friendly nations that could cushion or protect a blow, prevent an attack from the West, right? He's thinking defensively, but the United States see it more offensively because he uses his military to install communist governments. So he doesn't allow that self-determination that he promised. Instead, he uses his Red Army to make sure that similar governments to his are installed in these Eastern European nations. And so this is a cartoon from the perspective of the West, right? They see communism spreading first into Eastern Europe and then perhaps into Western Europe, right? You see the question mark of France, question mark of Sweden, and so the West feels threatened from this threat of the spread of communism, whereas from the Soviets' perspective, they're wanting to protect themselves from future attacks. But this, not knowing and not trusting leads to this Cold War. All right. To recap, they really see him, or begin to see him, as a dangerous dictator who wants to take over the world. We now know that that's not really the case. He's thinking more defensively, but again, that's not how the U.S. sees it, right? So by 1946, right, 1 year after the end of hostilities, right, Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he declares that an iron curtain, this divide, separates the democratic capitalist West from communist totalitarian East. All right, let's pause. Take a breath. Review your notes and answer this question. The United States and Great Britain believe that the liberated nations of Eastern Europe should A, B, or C, or D. Pause the video, come back for the answer. All right, did you put A? That is correct, right? When you read questions, be sure you identify the who, right? It didn't say the Soviet Union. It said the United States and Great Britain. They wanted free elections. Stalin eventually did not. All right, pressing on. Now that the United States sees Stalin as a threat, they adopt a policy called containment, right? Stop Soviet influence, stop the spread of communism. This is the main U.S. foreign policy for the rest of the Cold War. So anytime they thought communism would be spreading, they wanted to stop it, prevent it, not attack the Soviet Union. That would lead to open war, but to contain the spread. So how do you do that? Well, when the USSR began to pressure Greece, right here in Southern Europe, and Turkey to turn communist, the U.S. creates or adopts the Truman Doctrine, named after the president at the time, promising economic and military help to any nation threatened by communism. So it's not just words will stop the spread, but also actions. And it worked, right? Greece and Turkey did not become communism. And you see here, right, the kinds of military aid, former U.S. subs, former U.S. guns for the Turkish army, U.S. advisors, supplies, food, weapons, medicine, and even former U.S. planes, right? You see Turkey, right, shares a border right here with the Soviet Union and with these new communist countries of Romania and Bulgaria. All right, what about Western Europe? Right, there were fears that if the conditions were poor, that they might become enticed by the promises of communism, and so the United States, under the Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State George C. Marshall at the time, they offered $13 billion, right, in loans and in supplies to help rebuild post-war Europe, and it works. Western Europe recovers economically, and communism doesn't take root. There are communist movements and communist parties, but the countries in Western Europe don't become communist aligned countries. And just some numbers, right? Look, United Kingdom. Look at this amount. France, even smaller countries, Belgium, Netherlands, they all received massive influx. But notice, not in Eastern Europe. All right, in 48. So again, we're talking about these actions that lead to this distrust and ultimate hostility between East and West. That between USSR, Soviet Union, right? Czechoslovakia becomes communist under or thanks to USSR support. US again wants to contain. Thought Stalin would use similar tactics in Western Europe, send in his tanks perhaps into West Germany, perhaps into Greece, and so the United States forms the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. You need to know that acronym. It's a military alliance among democratic countries in Europe, Western Europe primarily, you see here, as well as North America, Canada, and the United States. And what it said is that if one nation is attacked, that all the other nations will come to their aid. A few years later, USSR establishes their own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. All right, lastly, let's end with what's going on in Germany, which is divided after World War II into zones occupied by, where should I put myself? There I am. By the US right here, by the British, I believe they're in green, and France here in purple, and then the USSR in the east. But Berlin, the capital, located in the Soviet zone of East Germany, is also divided. Stalin in 1948 wants all of Berlin to be part of the Soviet bloc, and he orders the Berlin blockade, shut down all ground transportation into West Berlin. You see this city, the capital here, right? So all the areas surrounding West Berlin, that's all Soviet territory. So he shuts off all roads, all trains, and essentially tries to starve them out. In response, the U.S. began what became known as the Berlin Airlift. For 11 months, planes from the British and the American sectors, right? They fly in and land food, fuel, supplies. 278,000 flights, 2.3 million tons of food, even Christmas gifts to the West Berliners, and it works. Stalin missed defeat and lifts the blockade in 1949, and West Berlin remained democratic and capitalistic for the rest of the Cold War, even though it was located deep in communist East Germany. All right. So that's the early part of the Cold War, this period of 1945 to 1949, where the U.S. wants to contain communism in Europe, and the Soviet Union wants to create a buffer area of friendly nations. But it doesn't end there. The Cold War eventually spreads and intensifies as it spreads, as communism spreads to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That's where we'll return in the next couple of lessons, but that's enough for today. We'll get to some spying in the future, Korean War, Vietnam War, Afghanistan War. All that's in the next couple of lessons. But let's end today with another check for understanding. The Truman Doctrine stated that the United States would provide what to nations threatened by communist expansions? Pause, go back, review your notes, come back to the answer. All right, did you say money? Yes, money, but military supplies would have been acceptable as well, but it's not one of the answer choices. To conclude, here's your processing assignment. We're going to work on body paragraphs again today. Summarize the origins of the Cold War, explaining how the Iron Curtain, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and rival alliances contributed to it. So remember, body paragraphs begin with a topic sentence. I've basically given it to you, right, in the question. There were many factors leading to the Cold War, or the origins of the Cold War have many factors, or the Cold War began for a number of reasons. And then I've given you the evidence, right? You don't even need to go find out what evidence you're going to use. In this question, I've given it to you. The evidence is Iron Curtain, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, rival alliances. I'm talking about NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, right? So now what you need to do is explain what those are, identify what is the Truman Doctrine, what is the Marshall Plan, etc. Identify them, and then explain how they led to the Cold War. That's your task. Let me know if you got questions in the Google Meet. I'll see you next time.